No one knows how the girl survived. 4 freezing nights, wolves in the dark, blood on her brow, and a nameless ash-gray horse that silently stood guard. No one believed it was real. But ash doesn't lie. It only rises when memory stops hurting and becomes light to lead the way. Subscribe now to follow our most powerful and emotionally raw cinematic stories. Ash fell from the sky like a memory burning its last breath. Tiny gray flakes, weightless and slow, drifted onto a blanket of white snow covering the pines of Pine Hollow. No fire, no smoke, just ash falling quiet and uninvited. It was the kind of cold that made sound feel hollow, like the world was holding its breath. And beneath that hush, something was watching. The wind stirred the trees outside a modest wooden house on the forest's edge. The kind of place that looked borrowed from a fairy tale at first glance. Log walls, a worn tire swing, turning gently a front porch with a chipped rocking chair too stubborn to creak. Snow dotted the railing like powdered sugar. And in the clearing behind it, laughter erupted like a spark. Emily ran barefoot through the backyard, in a puffy pink coat too big for her. Her boots had been flung off moments ago, forgotten like rules in springtime. 5 years old, all cheeks and bright eyes, hair like wild brush, chasing nothing and everything in circles. Her breath steamed in the air as she twirled with arms outstretched, catching snowflakes that weren't snow, just ash. She didn't notice. Her world hadn't been cracked yet. Through the frosted kitchen window, Rick watched. He stood with his hands folded neatly over a mug that wasn't warm anymore. The steam had long since stopped. His shirt was pressed too sharply for a casual morning, and his khakis had creases like military orders. There was something too still about him. The way he stared without blinking. His hair was slicked back but not wet. His jawline locked like someone who had memorized how to smile but forgot why. The camera on the windowsill blinked a tiny red dot. Rick's eyes flicked toward it, then away. His smile returned, but only for the lens. He opened the back door. Emmy he called using the nickname only he used. It hit the cold air with a practiced ease, too sweet like it had been rehearsed. Emily turned cheeks flushed, her smile wide. Uncle Rick, she beamed, stumbling back into her boots, one on the wrong foot. She charged up to him and threw her arms around his waist. Rick's hands hovered a moment, then rested lightly on her back. For half a second, his eyes softened. Then he glanced again at the woods, the camera, the ash. "Ready for our adventure?" he asked. She nodded so hard her knit hat nearly flew off. Inside the house, the living room was frozen in a time that hadn't moved since her mother's funeral. Soft toys untouched on shelves, a lamp with a torn shade, and picture frames that had been turned face down in a drawer. The woman who sat on the worn couch now looked nothing like the person in those pictures. Emily's Aunt Martha stared at her hands. They were clasped in her lap, ringing slowly. She wore a cardigan too thin for winter, and makeup smudged like she had cried but never wiped it away. The television was on mute, playing footage of the national park's snowy trails. Something about the cold wilderness being dangerous this season. Rick entered. "Sis," he said, voice neutral, not cold, not warm, just empty. "We'll be back by sundown." Martha didn't respond. She looked toward Emily, her eyes darting like a deer caught between two roads. "Maybe she stays today. Maybe next week," she murmured. Rick knelt, zipping up Emily's coat. "She needs the air. The grief's making her restless. Just a little hike. I know the trails." He stood. Their eyes met and something passed between them. Not quite threat, not quite plea, but it landed like a stone in her chest. "Of course you do," she whispered. Rick smiled, reached for the coat rack, and opened the door. Emily darted past him onto the porch, yelling something about snow angels. Martha stood slowly and followed them to the doorframe. "Make sure she wears her gloves," she said to the wind. Rick turned just once, expression unreadable. Then the door closed. The woods swallowed them. Cut to inside the car. Emily sat in the back seat, humming to herself, boots kicking the leather seat. The car winded down narrow roads, pines flanking both sides like silent sentinels. Snow clung to the edges of the windshield as Rick's fingers tapped the steering wheel. The radio played jazz, strange for a child's trip, but Rick didn't adjust it. Emily craned her neck. "Are we going to the place Mom went?" Rick's grip tightened just slightly. "What place?" "The place in the picture." She pointed to a photo tucked in her backpack pocket. It showed her mother standing on a cliff, smiling into the sunlight, mountains behind her. "She said she wanted to take me someday." Rick glanced at it, then back to the road. "Yeah," he said, "that's the one." Outside, the trees blurred like memories. The deeper they drove, the quieter it became. Even the snow seemed to hush. They parked beside a trailhead with a rusted sign half buried in snow, "Whisper Gorge. Unmarked route. Caution, no maintenance beyond this point." Emily stepped out, boots crunching snow. Rick locked the car and slung a small backpack over his shoulder. He had packed it himself. Emily had wanted to bring her toy fox. He'd said no. They started walking. Cut to the trail. Emily lagged behind, twirling, picking up pine cones, asking questions Rick didn't answer. His pace never changed, eyes forward, hands tight in his coat pockets. Uncle Rick, where's the wolves? There are no wolves, but the sign had one. Old sign. She looked back at the trees, as if expecting one to step out. They reached a clearing. Ahead, the cliff jutted out like a jagged tooth. The sky above was vast and pale blue, but the wind here was crueler, cutting sharp like it didn't want to be breathed. Rick stopped. This is it, he said. Emily looked around. Where's the view? Rick pointed toward the edge. Come closer. Emily hesitated. She walked carefully to the stone ridge. The snow here was thinner, wind harsher. She turned to say something, but Rick was already behind her. The world slowed. His hand touched her shoulder gently at first, like a guide. Then it pushed. Cut. Silence. Emily vanished. Rick stood over the edge, breath heavy. His face showed no panic, just stillness. He knelt, scraped the snow with his glove, then ran his fingers along the rocks, smudging boot prints. He pulled a small container from his coat pocket. Ashes. Not human. Just enough to dust the rocks and blend into the story. He stepped back, eyes distant. Then he screamed, a blood-curdling, guttural animal scream. He dropped to his knees, clawed at the snow, yelled her name like it had weight. Emily. Birds startled from the trees. His voice echoed once, twice, and then the forest swallowed it. He reached for his phone. Ranger dispatch, he sobbed into the receiver. My niece, she fell. She slipped. Please. God, please. The ash continued to fall, and in the wind, a shadow moved. Something had seen. Not man, not quite beast, but it had seen, and it remembered. Fade to black. Soundtrack fades in a low cello note, followed by distant hoofbeats. Ash on snow. The tires crunched through the snow, slow and deliberate, as Rick's SUV wound its way up the narrow path toward Pine Hollow National Park. The road was barely visible under a skin of gray-white ice. Pines, brittle and towering, stood on either side like frozen sentinels. Their limbs heavy with snow, and silence let nothing pass, not even the truth. Inside the car, the heater whirred low. Emily sat in the back, one leg swinging idly. Her mittened hands pressed against the window as she stared out at the trees rushing by like silent ghosts. Her face was flushed with excitement, not fear. She had no reason to fear. Not yet. Are we there yet? She asked, voice muffled by her scarf. Rick glanced at her in the rearview mirror. His jaw tightened a fraction. Almost, he said, with a controlled smile, eyes flicking back to the road. Emily went back to humming, tracing a foggy spiral on the glass. Her tune was tuneless, the kind children sing to keep themselves company. A melody that would never make it onto any radio. But it filled the car like warmth. Outside, the trees grew denser. The light changed. The sun vanished behind clouds too thin to see and too thick to let warmth in. It was the kind of light that makes everything look a little older, a little more forgotten. They reached a clearing. Rick parked, cut the engine, and silence poured in. He got out first, the crunch of his boots measured. Calm, unrushed. He opened the rear door for Emily and held out a gloved hand. She took it. The two of them stood for a moment in the brittle morning. The wind here felt different, thin, metallic, like it had forgotten how to carry scent or warmth. Pine Hollow stretched out before them, immense, untouched, indifferent. Emily turned in a slow circle. It's like a snow castle, she whispered. Rick looked down at her, the faintest flicker in his eyes. Yeah, he said, his voice hollow. A castle. He reached into his backpack, pulling out a small digital camera. Want to take some pictures for Aunt Martha? Emily beamed. Can I hold it? Rick shook his head. I'll take them. You pose. She didn't question him. He snapped a few photos of her standing near a tree, arms spread like a bird mid-flight. Then another by a half-buried boulder. All staged. All deliberate. As if he were building a timeline, a trail to follow. A memory kit for when she would no longer be there to remember. Then he pointed toward the edge. Let's get one at the overlook, he said. She hesitated for the first time, her eyes narrowing toward the jagged rocks that framed the drop. Is it safe? Of course. I'm right here. He extended his hand again. She took it. They walked slowly, his grip firm but gentle. The trees thinned and the terrain turned uneven. Rocks jutted out like forgotten bones. The snow here was thinner, scabbed with dirt and frostbitten moss. A single hawk called in the distance, 3 sharp cries like a warning that no one could hear. Emily reached the edge and looked down. Below, the gorge yawned wide, an open wound carved by time and ice. It was beautiful in the way a knife is beautiful. Precise, cold, irreversible. Far beneath them, broken trees leaned like crippled soldiers, limbs snapped and blackened from some long-ago fire. No guardrails, no safety signs, just stone wind and silence. Emily turned to say something. Rick struck. It wasn't violent, not in the way people imagined violence. No raised hand, no shove, just a push, a shift in weight. A betrayal written in body language so calm it might have been a mistake, if not for the expression that flickered across his face as she went over. She didn't scream. There was no time. Only the rush of air, the snap of her scarf unraveling mid-fall, and the sound of the wind tearing her name from the earth. Rick stood at the edge, unmoving. He stared down for several long seconds. His breath steamed, but his expression didn't change. Not fear, not regret. Just a grim sort of satisfaction. The job was done. A clean break. He turned from the cliff, knelt, and began his next performance. He pulled the camera from his pocket again, turned the lens on the cliffside, and clicked images of scuff marks in the snow, broken branches near the edge, the lone pink mitten she had dropped earlier that morning. He placed it carefully on a rock, dusting it with snow, then taking another photo. Then came the hard part. Rick reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a tiny vial. He uncapped it, tilted it over his fingertips, and let a fine powder fall onto his cheeks. His eyes closed. The particles stung, and tears welled up, real tears forced from chemical pain. He leaned back, tilted his face to the sky, and let out a sound so raw, so guttural, it pierced even the trees. Emily. The name split the air like a blade. He screamed again louder, falling to his knees in the snow. His fists slammed the earth in practiced grief. The woods echoed, bounced his cries back at him as if mocking the charade. Then silence. Birds flapped into the air. A fox darted behind a snowbank. But the trees said nothing. They had seen it all before. Rick reached into his pocket again, pulled out his phone, and called 911. Emergency dispatch. My niece, she fell. He gasped, breath hitching. She was right beside me. We were taking photos, and she slipped. I couldn't grab her. Oh, God. The operator began asking questions, but his answers were jumbled, chaotic, precisely what a man in shock might say. Pine Hollow, Whisper Gorge. Near the old trail, yes, please just hurry. He dropped the phone into the snow, letting the operator's voice continue from the speaker. Rick fell back onto his heels and wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket. Then he glanced to the cliff again. Still no sign of movement below. Just snow, just cold, just silence. Then the wind shifted, and with it, something strange. From somewhere behind him on the breeze, ash began to fall, thin gray, drifting gently. It danced across the snow like dust from forgotten ruins. It touched the rocks, the branches of his coat. Rick looked up. There was no smoke, no fire, just the ash. He blinked, stepped back, shook his head like he was shaking off a dream. Far below, at the lip of the gorge's first ledge, Emily's small body lay crumpled, but breathing curled against the jagged wall. Snow fell on her coat. A smear of blood darkened the rock beside her head. She didn't move. Not yet. But the fall hadn't finished the job. She had landed on a sloped shelf just beneath the edge, one that couldn't be seen from above. A freak miracle. Or maybe something more. The ash reached her too. It clung to her hair, her cheeks, her scarf. A gray halo. Back at the cliff, Rick turned and began walking briskly back toward the SUV, rehearsing his story. He would meet the rangers, guide them back, fall apart in front of the cameras. Say the right things. Play the grieving uncle. The next of kin. The only one left. As he disappeared into the trees, the wind kicked up. The ash danced across the ledge, wrapping the world in silence once again. And Emily, broken, unconscious but alive, was no longer alone. Deep in the woods, something else had heard. And it had started to move. Darkness didn't just cover her, it swallowed her. It was not sleep. It was not unconsciousness. It was something more primal. A silent compression of memory, fear, and the weight of cold stone pressing against flesh, too small to break the fall. Emily's fingers twitched first. The rest of her followed slowly, painfully, as if rising from beneath ice. Her breath came out in shallow gasps, visible in the frigid air, misting against the jagged stone wall she was curled against. Her coat was torn near the waist, her right boot missing. Blood, dark, almost black, trailed down from a gash on her forehead, crusting over her eyebrow and into the corner of her eye. But she didn't cry. Her eyes opened unfocused and glassy, staring at the rippling darkness ahead. For a moment, everything was still. Then the cold hit. It moved into her bones like smoke seeping, reminding her this wasn't a nightmare. She was alive and alone. The ledge beneath her was barely 2 feet wide. A jagged outcropping, half concealed by shadow, cupped her broken form like the curled palm of something ancient and uncaring. Snow dusted her back. Rock bit her side. Then came the sound, a low crunch of movement. She turned her head slow and stiff toward the cave mouth just feet away. The darkness inside was layered, not black, but shifting alive. Something was moving in there, something not wind. And then eyes, 6 pairs, maybe more, glowing in that ghostly amber that doesn't blink, doesn't flinch, just watches. Cold, patient, predators. Wolves, they didn't growl. That would have wasted energy. They didn't rush her, not yet. They stood in silence, half submerged in shadow, their breath fogging softly in the cold. One of them took a step forward, silent, as moonlight nostrils flaring. Emily froze. Her body refused to move, not out of strategy, but from a deeper cellular memory. Prey stillness, ancient instinct. The lead wolf tilted its head. A faint growl vibrated from its throat. Not aggression yet. Curiosity, hunger. Her lips parted. Not to scream, to breathe. Carefully, slowly. From the depth of the cave, light flickered. Not fire, not man-made, but the faint shimmer of moonlight refracting through frost and dripping ice, casting eerie reflections on the fur of the wolves. Their shapes wavered, expanded, shadows that looked like myths. And then hoofbeats, a sudden echo of weight and rhythm. The wolves reacted instantly, snapping their heads toward the sound. Hackles rose. Bodies shifted into defensive arcs. The sound grew louder, hoofbeats crashing through underbrush. Fast, controlled chaos. Snow exploded from the tree line. Something large, pale, moving like smoke over water. Ash. He broke through the clearing like a bullet from heaven. Hooves pounding into the snowpack, breath billowing from flared nostrils like engine steam. His mane, silver gray and tangled, flew wild behind him. Muscles rippled across his chest as he circled the wolves without touching them, just outside their strike range. He didn't neigh, he didn't rear. He ran, tight, wide circles, each lap drawing the wolves' attention, disrupting their formation. The lead wolf snarled, but didn't chase. Another darted forward, then stopped. Ash's movement was surgical, relentless, drawing an invisible perimeter between Emily and the threat. Emily remained frozen on the ledge, her eyes following the orbit of the horse, with a confusion that bordered on disbelief. He was beautiful. Not like the horses in books. There was nothing polished or domestic about him. He looked like he had been sculpted from the forest itself, mud ash, wind scars. One eye was clouded, a faint slash across his flank told of an old wound, but he moved with impossible grace. A phantom, a sentinel, Josam. One of the wolves lunged more in frustration than conviction. Ash responded with a shift of weight, hooves stomping hard snow, scattering in violent tufts. No contact. But the message was clear. Back off. It worked. The wolves retreated, not defeated, but disengaged. One by one, they turned and melted into the forest. Their eyes were the last to go. Silence returned. Ash stopped, stood facing Emily. His chest heaved, his breath steamed, and then stillness. He looked at her, not glanced. Looked like he recognized her, or like he was waiting to be recognized. Emily blinked. Blood ran down her cheek again, hot against the cold. Her lips trembled not from fear, but from the intensity of what stood before her. Ash took a single step forward. His body lowered not entirely, just enough to shift his shoulder toward her. A subtle gesture, an offering. She didn't understand. Not in the way adults might demand comprehension. But something inside her, a rhythm older than words, responded. Her arm lifted, slowly, shaking. She reached toward him, fingers grazing his coat. Rough, warm, alive. He did not move. She shifted. Her knees scraped the stone, but she rose. Every part of her body screamed in protest. Cold pain, gravity. But she rose. She pressed her hands to his side, pulled herself onto him, clutching a chunk of his mane, face pressed against his neck. Ash stepped carefully away from the cliff into the snowy woods, and the ash began to fall again. From the sky, from the canopy, from somewhere unseen. It drifted across his back and her shoulders, painting them in memory. In the clearing, they left behind the wolves, watched from the shadows, not hunting, witnessing. Ash trotted into the trees, vanishing between trunks. And Emily, cradled against the only warmth she knew, closed her eyes, not in surrender, but in survival. No tears, just breath and movement, and the echo of hooves in a world that had tried to forget her. Ash stood still, his hooves planted firmly in the crust of snow, steam curling from his flanks as the last traces of the wolves disappeared into the forest's deep. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence left behind by danger that hadn't gone far, the kind that hums beneath the skin. The world around them held its breath. Emily stirred. Every movement was an act of defiance. Her arms trembled. Her lips had turned blue. The blood on her cheek had dried and cracked in a jagged arc from her temple to her chin. Her knees slipped on the rock, scraped open again, fresh red, blooming into the white below her. She didn't cry. She blinked against the snow, and the pain looked up. Ash turned his head slightly. One pale eye met hers. They didn't speak. But something passed between them. Something language would have ruined. It was not trust. Not yet. It was recognition. Two creatures alone in a world that had tried to discard them. She reached. Her tiny fingers, still stiff and bleeding at the knuckles, found his mane. Tangled. Matted. Wild as the wind that whistled between the trees. He didn't flinch. Instead, slowly, deliberately, Ash bent one knee, lowering himself, not completely, but enough. Enough for her to try. It wasn't graceful. She slipped once the weight of her broken body too much. Her ribs flared with pain. Her breath came out in shattered wheezes. She pressed her face into his neck for a second, gathering strength from the heat there. Then, teeth clenched, she pulled herself up. One leg swung across his back. Her arms wrapped around the thick cord of his neck. Her cheek rested against his shoulder. She didn't sit tall. She clung, like a child to a memory. Ash stood. Snow scattered from his back as he straightened powerful legs, moving beneath her, like pistons of breath and bone. The wind hit them again. Emily buried her face deeper into the heat. The taste of salt and blood filled her mouth. He began to move. No path, no direction, just movement. Through trees as black as soot, under branches that clawed like skeletal hands, through snow that swallowed hoofprints faster than they were made. Ash carried her. No one spoke. No music, no words. Just the sound of hooves breaking crusted earth, of wind howling between trunks, like a mother mourning of ice crackling underweight that was never meant to be there. The light began to die, not all at once. It bled from the edges. First the whites turned blue, the shadows thickened. Twilight in this part of the world felt like the forest pulling a curtain across the sky. And as the last glint of sun vanished behind the ridge, the temperature dropped like a verdict. Freezing. Ash didn't slow. The forest opened onto a clearing, a small one ringed with stumps, and a long dead fire pit covered in ice. It was not shelter, but it would have to do. He stopped, lowered himself again. Emily slid off his back knees, buckling beneath her. She collapsed to the snow, hands sinking into the cold as she tried to rise. He nuzzled her shoulder once gently, then turned. He began gathering, not firewood. There was no fire. But he moved in strange arcs, creating a circle around her. Stomping, disturbing the snow, drawing something invisible that only he understood. Emily crawled to the center of the space he'd marked, curled in on herself. The first flakes began to fall. Not snow, freezing rain. Tiny shards of glass from the sky slicing through the forest with a sound like whispers and razors. She flinched at the touch of it, covered her head with her arms. Ash moved behind her, slowly lowering himself beside her. He positioned his body like a wall, his flank blocking the wind, his chest curving around her like a cradle. She didn't understand why, only that it helped. The night took them. Time unraveled. She dozed. Not deeply, not safely, in and out. Between shivers, between dreams of falling and wolves and a man's eyes that never looked at her when she was happy, only when she was still. Once she woke to the sound of Ash breathing, slow and thunderous. She placed a hand on his side and felt the steady rise and fall. It was the only rhythm left in the world. Her own breath synced to it like a whisper following a drum. At some point, she didn't know when her head dropped forward. Her arms went limp. She slept, and the ash began to fall again. This time it came with the wind sweeping through the forest like memory undone. It coated Ash's back, clinging to his mane, collecting in the folds of Emily's torn coat. When morning crept in, pale and merciless, it found them like that. Emily curled against his side. Ash curled around her like armor. Snow blanketed the clearing, smoothing over the circle he had made. Emily stirred, her eyes opened slowly, vision hazy from sleep and dried blood. She shifted, feeling the sting of wounds. Then something warm fell over her. She looked up. The sun had begun to rise. It wasn't bright, but it existed. Ash was standing again, watching the trees. His entire back was dusted in gray ash. Blown from somewhere distant, maybe a burn scar in the mountains, maybe from something no map recorded. And where she had rested against him, her coat now bore the same dust, mixed with her blood, gray on red, wound and wonder. She touched the stain without knowing why. Ash turned, met her gaze, then without prompting lowered again. It was time to move. She didn't speak. She didn't smile, but she climbed back on. And the two of them, ash-covered, frostbitten, made of grit, and the pieces the world had left behind, moved forward again. Through a forest that no longer looked quite the same, and into a day that didn't promise safety, only the chance to keep going. The woods began to change. Not softer, never that, but stranger. The trees leaned closer together, not in menace, but as if whispering to one another. The snow turned shallow, packed tighter to the earth. Beneath Ash's hooves, old paths returned half-swallowed tire tracks, broken wooden markers lost to frost. Civilization's footprints long erased by time. Emily clung tighter to Ash's neck. Her fingers had gone numb hours ago, her knuckles bloodless and raw. She wasn't sure how long they'd been moving now. It might have been minutes or days. But then, the trees parted, and before them stood a skeletal structure, hunched beneath a sagging roof of corrugated steel and rotting shingles. Vines had consumed the far wall, climbing like veins across what once had been windows. A leaning sign hung askew from rusted chains barely legible beneath layers of moss and ash. Pine Hollow, Biological Research Outpost. Closed. Ash stopped. Emily slid off her knees, folding as her feet hit the ground. The snow here was thinner, the air oddly still. Dead quiet. Even the wind refused to touch this place. The door was cracked. She pushed it open with both hands. It groaned. Inside, the air smelled like iron, and dust of paper turned to powder, and plastic left too long in the sun. Mice droppings dotted the corners. A shattered monitor lay face down near an overturned desk. Ash remained at the doorway, watching her. He made no move to enter. Emily stepped forward slowly, each footfall stirring up memories that didn't belong to her. Shelves lined the walls, filled with curled lab notes, coffee mugs still stained with rings, a broken microscope, a pair of glasses hanging from a single arm on the edge of a sink. The place was frozen mid-thought. Like whoever had been here had intended to return but never did. She made her way to the back wall. A desk larger than the rest was anchored there. Behind it, a glass window fogged with time. She squinted through the grime and saw something, a solar panel, half buried beneath a thin crust of snow on the roof slope. Her breath caught. She remembered. A hand. Brown-skinned, wrinkled, calloused, gently adjusting a strap on her school backpack. A woman's voice, low, calm, and certain, speaking over a classroom hum. When you're scared, Emmy, stop. Breathe in 4, hold 4, out 4, like waves. Fear is a tide. And you're the sand. You don't move easy. The woman had been a traveling nurse. Native. Apache, maybe. She'd come in for a few weeks when Emily caught a chest infection. But she left behind something bigger than medicine. Her mother had called her Nurse Vi. Emily pressed a trembling hand to her chest. 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out. She turned toward the desk. There, half buried beneath a stack of peeled papers, was a flat, dust-covered slab. She swept her hand across the surface. A solar battery, old but intact. Her heart pounded now, not from fear but from fire. She yanked it forward, almost toppling it off the desk. A tangle of frayed cables spilled out from the back. She followed them with her eyes. One led into a wall-mounted emergency comm unit. It was half-rusted shut, her fingers stiff and cracked clawed at the casing. She slipped, cursed under her breath, tried again. The panel snapped loose with a shriek. Wires, corroded, tangled like roots. But just one still carried a faint pulse. A tiny red diode blinked once, then again. She screamed, not out loud, inside, a scream of disbelief. She jammed her palm against the power button. Nothing. She opened a drawer, found nothing but rubber bands and a fossilized granola bar. Another drawer, empty. Then bottom left, a cracked portable radio, a manual transmitter. Obsolete but still real. She pulled it out, wiped it clean with her sleeve, scanned the channel dial. Nothing but static. She hit the power again. No light. She grabbed the cable from the solar panel, plugged it in. For 3 heartbeats, nothing. Then, click, a tiny whine. Then a voice. Warbled, cut with static. Not active. Last burn zone registered. Trail inaccessible. Emily dropped the radio in shock. It clattered to the floor, then buzzed again. She fell to her knees, cradling it. Turned the volume knob gently. If you're near the ridgeline, do not enter the northern slope. Reports of deadfall. A man's voice. Rough, familiar, not to her but to the woods. It wasn't speaking to her. It wasn't meant to be heard. It was a loop. A ranger broadcast. On emergency frequency. She brought it closer to her ear. And if you pass the old burn line, don't trust the markers. They're dated. We never finished the new ones. The grid failed after the fire. Her eyes widened. The fire. 2 years ago, a wildfire had eaten part of Pine Hollow. Her mother had talked about it. How the rangers abandoned the northern grid, shut off lines. Too unstable, they'd said. Too remote. But it meant something else now. Emily scrambled toward the filing cabinet next to the desk, yanked open a drawer, praying it hadn't locked shut from rust. Maps. Dozens. Laminated. Charred at the corners. She found one marked Grid-L, Northern Burn Zone. Her eyes scanned it. Fingers tracing along lines and roads, bridges, and foot trails, long erased from memory. There, faint but legible, a utility line path once used to string power across the research stations. If the fire hadn't melted it, it might still conduct signal, even faintly. She folded the map, shoved it under her coat, and ran back to the door. Ash was still waiting. He watched her. She didn't explain, just climbed up and pointed. Forward. He obeyed. As they moved again, wind picking up snow beginning to fall sideways. Now Emily's thoughts flickered back, not to the wolves, not even to Rick, but to another voice, another ghost, from the speaker inside the station before the feed cut out. Another broadcast, fainter. A secondary voice layered beneath the rangers. When the fire passed, we marked the trees, but the ash covered everything. You gotta feel for the burn, not look for it. It smells like wet coin and feels warmer than snow. That voice, old, warm, male, the forest warden. Her mother had mentioned him. Retired. Half-mad, people said. Still radioed into dead channels. Still patrolled trails nobody walked. She hadn't understood him then. She did now. Feel the burn, not see it. The ash doesn't lie. She looked down at Ash's back, covered in gray, dusted like a road, a trail. And she realized something: she hadn't chosen him. He had chosen her, because she was ash too, broken off something that used to burn, and still alive. The first snowflake fell like a lie, soft, weightless, pretending to be innocent. Then came the others. Fast, angry, no longer falling, but slamming. Within minutes, the sky was erased, replaced by a howl so loud it felt alive. Wind screamed through the pines in long, spiraling sobs. Trees bent like they were praying. The storm didn't arrive, it attacked. Ash slowed as the snow thickened. Emily, still clinging to his back, ducked against the wind, her cheek pressed against the warmth of his neck. But even his body heat began to lose its fight against the cold. Her eyelids fluttered. Her grip weakened. Ash stopped. They stood in a small clearing surrounded by pine skeletons. Visibility was nearly gone. The world had become a tunnel of white and noise. Ash let out one long breath, then turned sideways, pressing his massive flank against the storm's force. He knelt slowly. Emily slid off. Her knees collapsed under her. Her legs were no longer legs. They were ice-shaped like limbs. She trembled violently, trying to crawl under his body. He shifted to shield her fully, his side against her, like a barrier of stone and breath. But it wasn't enough. She was going to freeze. She could feel it not as fear, but as something simpler. A truth. Like her body had already made a decision and was gently informing her of the plan. She curled into herself. Somewhere in her haze, she remembered wood. Shelter. Something, anything. She crawled forward, fingers clawing at the snow, until they struck something solid. A fallen branch. Then another. Rotted logs, half frozen. She dragged them with what strength she had left, teeth chattering so hard her skull hurt. Ash watched her, motionless, waiting. She stacked the logs. Pathetic. Useless. They didn't create warmth, but they gave shape form, something to press against. She huddled behind them, the wind slicing less directly now. But it still came. She pulled her coat tighter. Useless. Her skin was past shivering now. Her face had turned pale violet. Her lips cracked with each breath. Ash stepped closer. He lowered his head, pressing his muzzle gently to her back. She didn't move. His body curled again, this time tighter, his chest aligned with hers, blocking wind-catching flakes. Still she trembled, her eyes shut, her breathing slowed. Ash let out a sound, a deep, low vibration. Not quite a whinny, not a cry. A morning, night collapsed around them. Darkness swelled in the sky and ground until it swallowed the line between sleep and death. And the solar beacon, the small battered transmitter clipped to her waist, kept blinking. Faint, inconsistent, but blinking. Somewhere a machine heard. Miles away, in a cluttered ranger office that smelled of old coffee and soaked boots, a monitor blinked red. No one noticed at first. Then a young man in turn maybe looked up. "Hey," he called out. No answer. He stared at the screen, frowning, then leaned forward. Outside, a snowplow rumbled past the window. In another part of town, Rick was zipping up a black duffel bag. His hands moved with precision, like someone packing for something permanent. His eyes were vacant, calculating. Cash, passport, a prepaid phone. He checked his watch, then looked up at the mirror above the dresser, and flinched. It was a trick of the light. He told himself that. The ash on his shoulder. The way his own reflection looked at him, not quite aligned, not quite delayed. He turned away, hard. Behind him, the TV buzzed faintly. Missing girl in Pine Hollow still not found. Snowfall complicates rescue. He turned the volume down, then off. Silence. He exhaled. But the silence didn't last. A knock at the door. He froze. Another knock. Louder. He stepped cautiously forward and opened it a crack. "Martha." hair wet from snow, face pale, eyes no longer confused. She pushed the door wide and walked past him. He didn't stop her. She stood in the middle of the room, staring at the packed bag. Then at him. How long, she asked. He said nothing. Since when were you planning this? Still nothing. I found your documents. She continued, her voice hollow. The court filings. The ones you never sent. But you had them. For custody, for power of attorney. Rick walked to the window, stared at the storm. You think I don't see you? She said. Her voice shook. Not from cold, from rage, or something deeper. I talked to the Rangers, she said. They let me hear the call you made. Rick turned. You sounded scared, she whispered. But not about her, about yourself. He looked at her, a long, cold stare. You want to know why, he said finally. She nodded. Rick stepped closer. His voice dropped. When you were 10, Mom left. When I was 6, she locked me in a closet because I cried too much. You were her favorite. You got the hugs. I got the back of her hand. Martha blinked. You had birthdays. I had bruises, he continued. You got a therapist. I got sent to the pastor for discipline. You got to stay. I got sent away. Martha's lip trembled. I was forgotten, he hissed. So when that little girl came into this house, with her eyes and her laugh and her goddamn innocence, she was everything I never got to be. And I hated her for it. Martha took a step back. I went to therapy, he said, laughing bitterly. I sat in circles and told strangers how I didn't feel anything. And they told me that was normal. You were supposed to protect her, Martha whispered. Rick shook his head slowly. No, he said. I was supposed to erase her. He turned away. Martha stood frozen. Outside, the wind howled louder. Back in the woods, morning had not arrived, but the storm had softened. Just slightly. Emily stirred, not awake, but not gone. Ash still lay beside her, his flank trembling now, frost caked to his eyelashes. The transmitter blinked again. A pulse. Faint, but real, and not far off engines. Distant, approaching. Hope made of fuel and light. The mountains breathed in silence. No birds, no wolves. Just the wind hollow soft now, like something exhausted after rage. High above the forest, a rescue chopper sliced through the air, its blades chopping the white sky into rotating pieces. Inside the cabin was dim lit only by the blinking panel lights and the occasional flare of static from a radio tuned to wilderness distress frequencies. Picking anything up? The co-pilot asked, his gloved hands tight on the map. The pilot scanned the radar. Weak ping, he said. Flickering. South ridge, maybe 20 clicks. Could be interference. Could be a prank. Or it could be the girl. No one spoke for a moment. Then the chopper dipped lower. On the forest floor, Ash pressed forward through the thinning snowdrifts, carrying Emily higher, where the trees grew sparse and the wind snapped harder. His hooves crushed through icy bark, crunching rhythmically as he climbed the rocky slope. His legs, still strong, bore the full weight of her fragile body, still limp, still curled but breathing. Alive. Emily stirred. It wasn't a dream this time. She could feel it, the change in air, the altitude. The wind here smelled different, sharper, cleaner. Like something sacred. She lifted her head weakly and blinked into the pale horizon. They were near the summit of a ridge. The forest below stretched endlessly in every direction, a quilt of grays and whites and bones. But here at this edge, the sky opened like a wound. Ash stopped. Emily slid off her feet, barely steady. Her knees buckled and she dropped to the snow. But this time she didn't curl inward. She reached under her coat, pulled out the red sweatshirt, the one she'd worn under all her layers, the one that hadn't been warm enough. She stood slowly, arm trembling, and raised it overhead. The red fabric flapped in the wind, violent, urgent, like a scream with no sound. She waved. No answer. Not yet. She scanned the sky, blinking against the wind. Nothing but clouds and sky and silence. Then a gust hit her square in the chest, hard enough to knock her back. The sweatshirt slipped from her fingers. No, too late. The red fabric flew, caught in the gale like a bird finally freed. It spiraled into the air, then dipped, then disappeared into the trees far below. Emily stared. And then for the first time since the fall, she cried. Not the silent, tremble-lipped kind. Not the childlike sobs she used to make when scraped knees or broken toys ruined a morning. This was different. This was the cry of someone who had done everything, given everything, and still wasn't seen. She dropped to her knees, shoulders shaking, hands buried in the snow, face pressed to the cold. Ash stood still beside her, watching. Then he moved, not toward her, toward the edge of the ridge. He turned to face the open sky, planted his hooves wide, and let out a sound so sharp and sudden it broke the air like glass. His hoof struck the rock beneath him once, twice, then again. The ground echoed. The rhythm was primal, loud, deliberate. A signal, then silence, and then an answer. A distant rustle, a beat of wings. From the forest below, black shapes rose. 1, then 4, then a dozen. Crows. They erupted from the trees like ink spilled across parchment, their cries tearing through the quiet like war drums. They wheeled in the air, circling once, twice, rising with the thermal wind. Ash struck the earth again. The flock wheeled higher, the movement sharp, wide, unmistakable, a dark spiral against the pale sky. In the cockpit of the rescue chopper, the co-pilot looked up from the screen. Visual, he barked, 11 o'clock movement. The pilot squinted. Birds. Too many. Coordinated. Not natural. Definitely not random. They banked left. The chopper veered hard, engines straining, closing the gap. Back on the ridge, Emily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, following the bird's trajectory. Then far off, cutting through the storm-gray clouds, she saw it. A shimmer. A rotor. The unmistakable sound, distant, muffled, but real. Her lips parted. The sound grew louder. Ash stepped back as if yielding the stage to her. Emily stood again, legs shaking, hands raised. The chopper came into view low and slow, scanning the ridge. She screamed. Here, no one heard. But the birds did. And they rose again, flaring like a signal fire jet, black against the snow. In the cockpit, the pilot pointed. There. He dipped lower. Emily jumped, waved both arms. And then, spotlight. It hit her chest like an avalanche of light. She collapsed under its warmth, shielding her eyes. Kid on the ridge, the radio crackled. They descended. Ropes, harnesses, voices. The sound of rescue, of return. Emily lay back in the snow, blinking at the sky, laughing. Crying. Both. Neither. Ash stood behind her, unmoving, watching. The trosam, the symbol of something that should have burned, should have vanished, but didn't. Now that symbol flew in the form of wings. The ash had become birds, and the birds had become hope. She turned to find him again, but he was already walking away. Back down the slope, into the snow, into the silence, into the trees, and the ash began to fall again. But this time it didn't sting. This time it shimmered. The harness clicked around her waist. A cold snap of nylon. Rough against her skin. Too tight, then tighter. The ranger's hands didn't shake, but Emily could feel the urgency in their rhythm. Another strap over her shoulder. A soft but sharp tug under her arms. He was muttering something, probably comforting words, but they didn't reach her. Not through the wind. Not through the adrenaline flooding her ears like a rising tide. Then came the signal. Thumbs up. A flare of red gloves against white sky. The hoist began. She lifted from the earth, not like flying, but like being pulled from deep water. Snow spun beneath her boots. The trees blurred, shrinking. Her fingers clenched the rope out of instinct, but it didn't help. She wasn't afraid. Just aware. Her body dangled. Her mind floated. The thudding of the chopper blades overtook everything. The wind roared around her. But inside, nothing. A vacuum. A stillness that came from being past the brink. Inside, the aircraft voices exploded into motion. She's hypothermic. Get the blanket, move. Vitals are weak, but present Jesus Christ. She's 5. Gloved hands wrapped her in layers of foil and wool. A mask pressed against her mouth. A finger checked her eyelids. The radio cracked again. Confirm recovery. Patient in transit. ETA 23 minutes. But Emily heard none of it. Her eyes stared through the floor. Through the boots around her. Through the noise. Her hand twitched. And that's when she remembered he wasn't here. Ash. She bolted upright, oxygen mask, yanked away. The medic shouted, "Hey, easy, don't." Emily twisted, tore at the harness. Ash, she screamed. But no one heard her through the rotors. No one but the forest. Below them, the trees rippled in the wake of the chopper's passage. Snow peeled away from the branches in thin sheets. The ridge grew smaller, then vanished. And on that last ledge of broken stone, Ash stood, still as a statue. He didn't rear, didn't gallop, didn't cry, just watched. Her small figure disappeared into the steel beast that roared above his world. His ears flicked once. Then he turned. No hesitation, no second glance. One hoof, then another, into the trees. Each step left behind a print soft, fading, already being swallowed by snow and ash. Emily leaned against the glass window of the chopper. She saw it. For the briefest moment through fog and flurry, his silhouette. Broad, proud, fading. Her palm pressed flat against the glass. She didn't call again. This wasn't a goodbye that asked for permission. It simply was. The trees closed behind him, like curtains on a stage that never had an audience. Ash moved slowly now, no destination. Just the rhythm of his body, reclaiming its solitude. Snow swirled around him. The last sunlight slipped between branches. His coat shimmered faintly with frost and memory. And behind him, the faintest trail of ash curled in his wake, rising from hooves, from wind, from the place where death had been written, but life had chosen another script. The ash wasn't falling anymore. It was lifting, dancing. Emily lay back against the floor of the aircraft. Her breath fogged the mask. Her hands trembled beneath the blankets, not from cold, but from something deeper. The medic reached down. "You're safe now," he said. Emily turned to him. Her voice was hoarse, almost broken. "The horse." He paused. "What horse, sweetheart?" She closed her eyes. not to forget, to remember harder. The silence settled again, no music, no celebration. Only the sound of a child's heartbeat sinking slowly back to the world, and the faint fading image of hooves disappearing beneath the trees. The last she would see of him, but not the last she would feel, because some creatures don't leave tracks. They leave symbols. The courtroom windows were fogged over with condensation, but the cold outside didn't compare to the silence inside. Rick sat stiffly in the defendant's chair, his face pale under the fluorescent lights, hands clasped like a statue carved out of control. The orange jumpsuit looked almost surreal on him. It didn't fit his image, clean-cut, trusted professional. But that image had cracked days ago. Now it was only the shell of a man whose secrets had run out of places to hide. He didn't look at anyone, not the judge, not the public defender beside him, not the reporters typing feverishly in the second row, and certainly not Martha. She stood behind the glass partition, hands clenched together just beneath her coat sleeves, watching her brother without blinking. Her eyes were calm now, not cold, not angry, just awake, wide open in a way they hadn't been for years. It had taken a storm to wake her. That and the confession she'd pried out of him 2 nights earlier before the Rangers came to arrest him. Now it was over, at least on paper. The prosecutor read through the charges as again child endangerment, attempted homicide, fraud. The language was clinical, void of emotion. A far cry from the scream Martha had heard over the phone the night he claimed Emily fell. That scream, it turned out, had been rehearsed. He'd practiced every part of it, except getting caught. The judge's gavel echoed like a final heartbeat in the room. Martha closed her eyes when it hit the desk. One sharp strike, then silence. Rick was led away in cuffs. He didn't resist, didn't glance back. As the officers guided him through the side door, Martha stepped forward. Stopped just shy of the glass that separated her from the hallway where he'd vanish. Her reflection wavered in the thick pain hers, and his for just a moment, superimposed. Then gone. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She turned and walked away. Outside the courthouse, the world had already moved on. Headlines flared on screens. Tragic hike, unmasks, hidden crime. Uncle's deception revealed after. Accidental fall. 5-year-old survives wilderness ordeal. Each headline flattened something sacred into soundbite. What none of them could explain, what they wouldn't even try to, was the horse. No one believed that part. Not really. Reporters had tried to press Emily, now resting in a private ward of the hospital, but the medical team had blocked access. Her only word since the rescue had been sparse. One sentence repeated with variations, "The gray horse carried me." The doctors chalked it up to trauma. Imagination. A child's coping mechanism. Something she'd created to survive what should have killed her. One journalist even called it the delusion of the wild. But Martha knew better. She sat beside Emily's bed that evening, watching her niece's tiny chest rise and fall beneath layers of hospital blankets. Tubes ran from her arms. Her lips were chapped. Her skin was still pale, but her eyes, those were awake too now. Like the forest had changed her shape. The nurse knocked gently on the door, but didn't enter. Martha leaned in, brushing a piece of hair from Emily's forehead. For a while, neither of them said anything. Then Emily whispered, "He didn't say goodbye." Martha frowned. "Who, honey?" Emily turned her head, her eyes blinking slowly. "Ash." Martha froze. Emily looked back at the ceiling. He watched, then left. He knew. Martha swallowed. Was it really a horse? Emily didn't answer right away. Then she said in the voice of someone much older than her years, "He was the forest. He just borrowed a shape I could follow." Martha stared at her. "Then, do you think your mother would have believed you?" Emily's eyes flickered. "I don't know." A pause. Then she asked, "Do you?" Martha sat back in the chair. Her eyes welled, but she didn't blink. "I want to," she said honestly. Emily's gaze softened, not with disappointment, but understanding. She did believe in things, Emily said, even if no one else did. Outside the window, the wind shifted, and a small swirl of ash swept past the glass, rising against the pane, like smoke remembering the fire it once belonged to. A week passed. The forest remained closed to the public part of the investigation, they said. Crews had gone to retrieve whatever belongings had been left behind. They found the red sweatshirt snagged in a tree near the ravine, her boot half buried in snow. The remains of the research station were marked for demolition, but no one found hoof prints. No dung, no tracks, no hair, no horse. One ranger, a younger one named Dave, had hesitated. Something about the way the snow had melted in a near-perfect circle around the outpost made him pause. He even took a photo. He showed it to his supervisor. "Thermal variation," the older man said. "Maybe she started a fire." Dave stared at the photo later that night, alone in his truck, and said quietly to himself, "But there were no matches." Back in town, Emily was discharged. Martha walked her out the side door of the hospital, away from cameras. They didn't speak much on the drive home, but as they passed the park near the edge of the forest, Emily looked out the window. Mama said the world didn't begin with us, she murmured. Martha kept her eyes on the road. She was right. Then why don't we believe in things that don't look like us? Emily asked. Martha didn't have an answer. The town had already begun shifting the story. Online forums debated the horse theory, some mocking, some romanticizing. Documentarians were requesting interviews. A podcast had started already, the Ash Rider myth or miracle. None of them mattered, not to Emily. She sat quietly on the porch that evening, wrapped in a blanket, staring toward the tree line. Martha brought her a cup of warm milk, sat beside her. The stars came out slow like shy eyes behind cloud lids. Emily didn't blink. Then, why do they think I made him up? Martha sipped her drink. Because people only believe in what they can touch, she said. Or own, or put on a leash. Emily turned her head. But nature doesn't work like that. Martha smiled. No, baby, it doesn't. Emily looked back to the trees. He wasn't saving me because I was special. He just didn't want me to die there. Martha didn't reply. Instead, she leaned forward and whispered. I saw a coyote once. In the city. On 7th and Pine. Middle of traffic. Everyone honked and shouted, but it didn't run. It walked. Like it belonged. And for a second, I swear it looked at me. Not afraid, not wild. Just present. Emily's eyes widened, and no one else saw. Oh, they saw. They just didn't understand. Emily nodded. They sat together in silence again. And in that silence, the forest held them from a distance. Watching, waiting, not as something to be proven, but as something already true. Years passed quietly. Not with ceremony, not with grand moments, but with the slow accumulation of steps, of small choices, of healing that didn't come like lightning, but like rain, steady, patient, relentless. Emily grew. She never grew tall. Her frame remained narrow bird-like, but her eyes, those grew sharper. They held that same wilderness she had once emerged from. Not wildness, not chaos, but awareness. She looked at people the way the forest had looked at her fully, without flinching, without begging to be understood. At 27, she walked into schools across the country and spoke to rooms full of children with voices too quiet and questions too strange for the world outside to welcome. Children in foster homes, in shelters, in wilderness recovery programs. She didn't tell them fairy tales. She told them truths. She never used the word miracle. She used words like instinct, trust, silence, and return. She carried with her only one object from her childhood, a single worn fragment of red fabric, now framed in a small glass case. It sat on every podium she used. A simple scrap, but the children always asked. And she always answered, it was the last thing I lost before I was found. When she wasn't speaking, she was writing. Her first book sold modestly, but steadily. A field guide for children titled, Not All Wild Things Bite. The second one became something else entirely. She called it Ash Never Said My Name. On the cover, a grayscale sketch of a child, curled against the shoulder of a horse, their outlines blending into fog. The first page opened with a single line. Some protectors don't make promises. They make paths. The chapters weren't arranged by timeline. They were arranged by instinct. Chapter 3 was titled, The Forest Doesn't Need to Prove Itself. Chapter 6, Breath Before Words. And Chapter 10, the one that children always asked her to read aloud, was titled simply, Gray Ash Never Calls Your Name. It was about the silence that saved her. The absence of language. The way some forms of love come without names, without claims, without explanation. It ended like this. I think if he had spoken, I wouldn't have listened. But because he didn't, because all he gave me was presence, I heard everything I needed. Not to be saved, but to walk forward. That chapter was taught in environmental literature courses. It was read at wilderness therapy retreats. It was painted in murals in juvenile centers across Oregon. But Emily didn't seek fame. She sought places where children hid, and she brought light there. Not the kind that blinds, the kind that reflects back just enough of who they were always becoming. Martha traveled with her. Gray streaked her hair now, but her steps were sure. She handled the logistics, the grant paperwork, the school contracts, the permits to bring a small horse to a city park for a demo day. Because yes, Emily had found a horse. Not Ash. Ash had never returned. But one day, years ago, a rescue center in eastern Montana sent her a photo, a storm-colored mare with burn scars along her right leg. They called her Smoke. Emily adopted her that same day. She never renamed her. Smoke wasn't Ash. She didn't need to be. But sometimes when Smoke moved through the field in early morning light, her hooves stirring frost into the air, Emily could feel that old rhythm again, that heartbeat of the mountain. She smiled more now. Not always, not often. But when she did, Martha always noticed. One day, after a community talk at a foster camp in Wyoming, As they packed up the projector and brochures, Martha paused. You ever think, she asked, what would have happened if it had been someone else? Emily didn't look up. If Rick had tried it with another child? No, Martha said. If Ash had never come? Emily paused. Her hand stilled on the box she was taping. I don't think I'd have died, she said. Not exactly. Martha tilted her head. No, I think I would have disappeared, Emily said softly. Not just from the world, from myself. Martha didn't answer. She didn't need to. That fall, Emily received a letter, handwritten, no return address. It said, my brother worked the dispatch line the day they found you. He swears he saw something moving along the ridge, something big. But the footage was too grainy. No one believed him. Just thought you should know. Emily folded the letter carefully, placed it between the pages of her journal beside a pressed feather and a pencil sketch of the gorge. Later that week, she taught a class at a nature preserve in Colorado. 30 kids, ages 8 to 16. They sat in a ring around her while she held a leaf to the light and asked, what does survival look like? One boy, no older than 10, raised his hand. It looks like not giving up. She nodded. Another girl said, it looks like having someone. And then a third child, small quiet, said, it looks like being seen, even when you're invisible. Emily smiled. That's the one she said. Later they fed smoke together. Later they hiked. And at the end of the day, as the sun died slowly into the red mountains, Emily stood on the porch of the visitor's lodge and stared at the tree line. Just for a moment, and for just a breath, she thought she saw a shape, gray, low, moving between the trunks. But she didn't call out. She just watched until it faded. Then she whispered thank you and turned back to the children who were waiting for her. To the next path, to the next return. The trees of Pine Hollow hadn't changed much in 20 years. Maybe they'd grown quieter. Maybe the wind sang softer through their branches. Maybe the forest had decided to keep fewer secrets. Or maybe it was just that Emily had finally learned how to listen to them without fear. She stepped out of the van and onto the familiar soil. The trailhead hadn't been paved, the wooden sign still chipped where some hunter's knife had carved initials decades ago. But the air, it was the same, sharp, honest. The kind of cold that met you with respect, not punishment. Behind her, the van door slid open. Children spilled out. 6 of them. Orphans, all of them. Some quiet, some loud. Some wide-eyed, some already too grown for their years. They each carried a small canvas pack and wore jackets in colors too bright for the muted forest. But Emily liked that. It was like a sunrise walking on 2 feet. Martha stood beside the van, watching with arms crossed, smiling but pretending to frown. You're sure this isn't too much for them? She asked. Emily turned one eyebrow raised. You were sure it wasn't too much for me? Martha chuckled. That was a long time ago. Emily looked out toward the trees. Not really, she said. The kids followed her in small groups, sticking close at first, then slowly peeling into pairs and trios, letting the space open around them. The forest didn't intimidate them. It intrigued them. That was the beauty of children who had already survived worse. They weren't afraid of silence, only of not being seen in it. Emily led them along the lower ridge path. Not toward the gorge. Not yet. That place didn't need their footsteps again. Not today. She led them instead to a clearing surrounded by tall pines and soft moss. The ground dipped just enough to make the world feel cupped held. They set up a circle of sitting stones, passed out canteens and seed bars. Let the sunlight filter through branches and settle on their faces. One boy, dark curls, thick eyebrows, a voice like gravel in a tin can, spoke first. Is this the place you almost died? Emily didn't flinch. No, she said gently. That place is farther, higher, colder. Another girl, maybe 9, raised her hand like she was still in school. Is this the place you came back to life? Emily smiled. Something like that. The group laughed a little, not mockery relief. They were safe here. They could ask anything. A moment passed. Then a small boy, quiet until now, thin as a sapling, freckles blooming across his nose, looked up from where he'd been drawing in the dirt with a stick. He asked, Do you really think horses can love people? The forest went still. Martha looked over, but Emily didn't glance her way. She crouched down beside the boy, ran a hand across the pine needle-covered earth, and looked toward the canopy. The wind shifted. She didn't answer, didn't nod, didn't tell a story. She simply looked up. The boy followed her gaze. Above them, the wind threaded through the trees, lifting the dry topsoil in fine particles. For a second, they seemed to hang suspended, glimmering specks of gray and gold, lifting toward the sky like breath. And then, wings, a rustle, a rush. A dozen birds burst through the canopy. Crows. Sharp, sudden, graceful. They didn't caw. They didn't dive. They simply passed overhead in a quiet sweep, shadows flickering across the children's faces like ancient stories. The little boy smiled. One of the girls gasped softly. Emily closed her eyes. and the ash danced again. It wasn't from a fire, not this time. It was memory reborn in motion, a shimmer of sam. The symbol of a wound burned so deep it left behind light. The ash rose through the branches, not falling this time, but carried upward on a breeze that knew where it needed to go. Martha stepped forward, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. Emily opened her eyes. The boy leaned toward her. "I think they were looking for you," he whispered. Emily didn't reply. She just nodded. And in that moment, something broke open, not in pain, but in release. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that simply walks in, sits beside you, and reminds you you're no longer carrying it alone. The wind quieted. The birds vanished, but the children remained. And in the center of their ring, where the sun now fell full and unbroken, a single spiral of ash lifted gently from the soil, rising toward the sky until it faded into light.